Hello, welcome to this Ned Davis Research podcast where we will help you see the signals. My name is Brian Sanborn, NDR's Global Head of Investment Solutions. In this episode, we will be speaking with NDR's Chief Economist, Alejandra Grindal, about the U.S. economy. Alejandra, prior to the election, how was the U.S. economy performing?
Thanks for having me. And the answer to your question is actually quite well. So the U.S. economy avoided recession and even stagnation, unlike many of its developed economy peers. And this comes after quite a bit of central bank tightening. And now that the Fed is easing, just in this latest quarter in Q3, the latest data available, real GDP grew a whopping 2.8% on an annualized basis. The U.S. economic recovery since the pandemic has even been more astounding, actually, especially when you compare it to the rest of the G7, so other developed economies. So since then, U.S. real GDP growth, so this is using the pre-pandemic period as a baseline, has grown 12%, or about 2.8% per annum. And there's no other economy in the G7 that has even cracked that 2% per annum mark. Thinking about why they had this relatively stronger economic growth, why the U.S. did, a lot of it is explained by just better growth potential. And there are two drivers of potential real GDP growth. One is labor force, so the all-important demographics, and productivity, which is how well you actually use those resources. And the US exceeds the rest of the G7 actually on both of these metrics. And unless there's any dramatic change in the US economy's structure, so those two components, it's poised to continue to do so in the future. And this is actually quite important for US equities, because if you look at the relative strength of the US economy compared to the rest of the developed world, it has actually coincided with the relative strength of its equity market performance.
And the equity markets absolutely soared in the days following President-elect Trump's victory. What is the potential impact to the US economy?
So looking at the bond market, the 10-year Treasury yield has risen to near the highest level since July. And this does reflect concerns about the path of government spending and what it could mean for inflation. Now, we need more information on proposed policies from this incoming administration, but at face value, tax cuts, tariffs, deportation of undocumented immigrants could amount to a significant bump in the government's budget, its budget deficit, because it already has one, so it would get worse, and then the debt. So the nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimates that Trump's plan would add $7.75 trillion to an already bloated outstanding government debt, which for now exceeds $35 trillion. So with the economy already operating slightly above potential, additional government stimulus at this stage of the cycle is typically inflationary. That's sort of the response you get. And historically, the acceleration in debt to GDP growth has been associated with a long increase in the gap between the 10-year Treasury yield and nominal real GDP growth. In other words, when debt grows faster than the economy, bond yields tend to rise as well. Now, while the increase in yields has so far not been a drag on the cyclical bull market in equities, the risk remains that a further and faster run-up in yields may eventually cause U.S. equities to stumble.
How would these policy proposals impact other economies?
That's a great question. So, I like to talk about tariffs, right? So tariffs have been touted as a major policy tool by President-elect Trump. And in addition to more targeted tariffs toward China and some sectors and certain economies, Trump has also proposed 10 to 20% tariffs on all U.S. imports. And Trump's multilateral approach, if it comes into fruition, would have much, relatively larger negative implications on global growth and inflation than the tariffs in the first term, which just mainly focused on China. The economies that rely most on their exports to the US are Mexico, Vietnam, and Canada. And each of those economies, it encompasses over 20% of their GDP. So that's quite a bit. Taiwan, other parts of Southeast Asia, such as Thailand and Malaysia, and even South Korea also have pretty large GDP exposures to the US economy. There's some with a little more moderate exposure. So at around 3% of their GDP are China. So, less than maybe some people think. The EU, Germany is a little higher than the EU average, and Japan. Contrary to that, India, the UK, and Brazil see US exports make up only about 2% of their GDP, and exposure to Australia and Turkey is quite minimal. It's quite small. So in terms of sectors and industries, transportation equipment and parts, led by autos, tops the list by far of most of these economies' exports to the US. Specifically, it's the largest export category coming from Mexico, from Japan, South Korea, and the EU. Another big one is machinery. So this includes both electrical and non-electrical. And, believe it or not, much of it is involved in key US production. It's an input. It's also a major export category among these economies. It's actually China's top export to the US, despite the existing tariffs. So we're still importing those items. It's also a major export to the US from Japan, the EU, South Korea, Vietnam, and Mexico. Many of these economies consider the US also a large recipient of their consumer goods. So this would sort of indicate potential inflation that could directly go to households. So Mexico and Canada, for example, provide quite a bit of food manufacturing to the United States. Vietnam in particular dominates on the consumer goods side. So they export a lot of computers, telephones, textiles, footwear, and even apparel to the United States. So a key risk to watch over the coming years is the US tariffs and the subsequent global retaliation that could, potentially mark a secular turning point in equities.
Alejandra, thank you for your insights. NDR clients can read Alejandra's research notes in her weekly Global Economic Focus publication. The indicators Alejandra and the research team developed for our subscription service are also used in our model portfolios, which are available for direct delivery on TAMPs and as ETFs. For more information on NDR, we encourage you to visit ndr.com. Also, for those listening in audio-only mode, video versions, including the charts of See the Signals, are available by going to info.ndr.com/ndr-signals. Thank you for joining us as we help you to see the signals. So long.